Okay, just before we start with you, Isaac, let's just see. Lau, are you next?
Yeah.
Lau is on,
The Aftermax conference, right?
yeah, actually, it won't be until a week from today. So you still have a week. Then we're back to Val again, starting the whole process over again. Wait a minute. Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yep, okay. So I think everybody knows, but just to make sure, Lal, you're doing yours on number 35, and right, you chose 35 and 58. You're doing 35 first?
Yes.
Okay, number 35, 35. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Oh, thanks. Hey, by the way, all I'm seeing is names. I'm assuming that the name implies a yes, that you did the reading? Okay, I kind of assumed that, but I wanted to be sure that you weren't just saying I'm here. Okay, all right, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the challenge this morning in chapel. Thank you for the privilege of bearing fruit. And these case studies that we look at are potential impediments to that. We wrestle with how best to represent Christ in Great Commission ministry in unique and challenging situations. And we're reminded that we live in a broken world where the answers aren't always as easy and cut and dried as we'd like them to be. And I pray that as we discuss this issue today, that you would grant Isaac the skill and the just the joy of sharing this and presenting some ideas, and that you would give us a really good time of discussion around the table. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. It's all yours. Is that son messing with you?
Yeah, a little bit.
Hang on, let me
That's
see
all
if I can, well, let me see if I can close. I don't know if I can.
Just say if you
I'm gonna
twist
turn the
it,
other
it
way.
just turns the other way.
Yep. Oh, now that looks nice. Spotlight on you.
We don't need a spotlight on
Is
it.
that all
That's
right?
okay.
Okay.
That'll work.
There you go.
All right, so this is case study number 30, To Bribe or Not to Bribe by Teng-Chin Go. Brief summary here. Pastor Luke is the pastor of a large Chinese church in the Philippines. He's getting older, and the congregation has, well, to put it lightly, strongly advised him to get an assistant pastor. He decided this was wise, so he and the elders went looking for an assistant. But there are very few people in training for the ministry within the Philippines, and the ones that weren't ready for it. So they decide to look at Taiwan. There are a lot of young men there who are training for the ministry and are really looking at going to the Philippines. So Pastor Luke goes over there and finds Reverend John, who is wanting to go there to serve as Luke's assistant pastor. The one problem is the immigration office will not give him a work permit quickly, not without a significant sum of money. There are stories of people waiting even 5 to 10 years for a work permit when there's no little grease money offered there. So now it's up to Pastor Luke to determine if he should offer a bribe to the immigration officer or not. When Pastor Luke brought the problem to the elders of the church, they told him to offer a bribe. They said to think of it more as a gift for services than as a bribe. They claimed that this was culturally acceptable. When Pastor Luke did not seem ready to bribe and hesitated, the elders even threatened to fire him and pay the bribe themselves. So, of our characters here, we obviously have Pastor Luke. He is an elderly pastor of a church in the Philippines that is just really in need of an assistant pastor, needs some revitalization. So he is going looking for an assistant pastor. Reverend John seems to be the answer for that. He's the next character. A Taiwanese man looking to minister in the Philippines and trying to get his work permit. Then you have the immigration officer who expects a bribe and will probably make it a long wait if he's not bribed. You also have the elders who are really desperately searching for really desperately searching for this assistant, even to the point of firing their current pastor to get him. So how do you want me to go about this? Because I can talk through a lot of the issues, or do you want to open it up for discussion? Like how?
You know, you can do it either way you want. You could present the issues that you have, or you could try to get us to come up with the issues ourselves, which might be an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. So, like, what do you see as like kind of the issues here?
Is bribing okay?
Yep, that is definitely the main one. Is bribing okay? Another issue might be whether the need for this pastor and the good of the church outweighs the potential bad of a bribe. We talked about a lot of stuff like this in ethics class. Like sometimes, like neither choice is great, so do you take the lesser of two evils? That might be another issue too.
Can I ask if somebody thought about an issue related to the sovereignty of God? Is there an issue connected to that in this?
There definitely could be.
In what way? See there.
You're asking me or
Oh,
asking
I'm
everyone?
asking the group.
Okay.
You already know all the answers. You've studied this.
Yeah, sort of.
They're basically saying if we take the bribe, he'll get in right away, and if we don't, then it'll take years. But God can make war happen regardless of.
Yep, the one problem is that the elders will most likely fire Pastor Luke, because that's what they said they would do if he didn't bribe the immigration officer. Like, we're going to fire you and go pay the bribe ourselves to get him in. It's kind of a hairy issue.
Mhm. I couldn't remember. I didn't discern in the reading of it if Pastor Luke is a national. Did I miss something there?
No, I don't know either. It didn't say.
Can we assume most likely that he is?
I think that's probably fair, but I don't know. He seems to have a lot of ways of thinking that are different from the nationals.
Name is a bit more English.
Name is, yeah, sometimes they,
Right, but then there's like Reverend John.
Reverend John.
Taiwanese, so it could just be giving them English names too. I would almost think he's not a national just based on the way he thinks compared to the elders. The elders are very ingrained in the Philippine culture there. Like when he came in, he preached very strongly against bribery and stuff like that. So he's got almost a different mindset, which makes me almost think he's not a national, but I obviously don't know.
Can I suggest possibly another issue? Or does it surprise anybody in here that there is nobody in this church or the area churches that would be a candidate for coming to help? It is a Chinese church in the Philippines. It's not a Filipino church.
So it's,
maybe that's part
so
of
it's like oddly specific too.
Mhm.
Right, because one of the biggest advantages of getting someone from Taiwan is someone who speaks the language already.
Mhm.
So it would be specially equipped for that sort of ministry. So if we go and then look back at the issues, so the first one then is bribing wrong. What are all of your thoughts on that? Do you see bribing as being biblically wrong? Do you see it as being okay in some circumstances? Do you see this as even being a bribe? As the elders were like, well, think of it just as a gift for services.
I think I'd want to look at the scriptures that talk about bribery. I know it's that could be in the Old Testament, but if I remember correctly, a lot of the bribing has to do with perverting justice.
Mm-hmm.
Like someone would go to a judge, pay a bribe so that the judge would do something unjust and judge against the poor person in their favor.
Mhm.
But I want to look at all the verses about bribery before I come to that conclusion.
Yeah, so you'd be looking at like Exodus 23:8, and you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous.
Which verse is that?
Exodus 23:8, or 1 Samuel 8:3. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So there are a ton of verses like that. And yes, that is most of the cases where bribery is talked about in the Old Testament is in regards to essentially perverting the words of the righteous, especially in like a court legal sense. In the New Testament, bribes aren't talked about a ton per se. It doesn't go into detail and talk about whether it's right or wrong. There are several instances of bribery, though. We have Acts 24:26 when Paul is before Felix. Felix was expecting a bribe from Paul. Obviously, Paul did not pay a bribe.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's descriptive or prescriptive could be up for debate. It could just be that Paul didn't have the means to do it. We don't know. Matthew 28:12-15 talks about the Sanhedrin bribing the guards to not tell where Jesus' body went. Say they came and stole it in the night. They bribed them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly the most heinous bribe was in Matthew 27:3-9, in which Judas was bribed to betray Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the New Testament, it doesn't talk about bribes a lot, but it's never put in a good light either.
Mm-hmm.
So could have been instances that were okay, but it doesn't show it that way in the passages that I saw. Are there any other passages? Any thoughts along those lines?
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
The title of this is To Bribe or Not to Bribe. Are we correct in assuming that the issue here is bribery? These elders say it's viewed as a gift. Is it possible, and I'm not taking a stand for or against, I'm just throwing out the question, is it possible that something within the justice system of this culture would legitimize this as a gift and illegitimize the word bribery connected to this story?
I did a fair amount of research into the culture, as I figured this would come up. So the Filipino culture is in a very transitional state. Obviously, they were kind of their own thing, but then they adopted a lot of Western legal ways as well. So it's in a transitional state, and a lot of their culture is still focused on what's best for the individual and the family, as opposed to what these legal rules off there are about. So culturally, most people there would bribe. Bribery technically is illegal, but is culturally acceptable. So here's a quote from an article I found. The study shows that out of nearly 80,000 cases of corruption, bribery, and other cases brought to these two courts from 1979 to 2006, there were only 27 meaningful convictions. So out of 80,000, only 27 were like really punished for that bribery.
Now they call them cases of corruption. Do you use the word
And
corruption?
bribery.
Okay.
Right. So they would consider bribery to be a form of corruption.
Is that an American source or a Filipino source?
That one was a Korean source, actually.
Korean. Okay, I'm sorry. Korean in reference to Korea or in reference to the Philippines?
So this was a Korean article comparing Korean justice with like Filipino justice and one other country as well.
Okay.
So like seeing rates of corruption and bribery and seeing how it all correlates. It was a really interesting one. It's listed under my bibliography there if you wanted to look at it. That's the one by you. I don't remember his first name, last name of you.
You is not me, by the way, it's the name of the author.
Yeah. you wrote this, you know?
You did.
So bribery in the Philippines is like officially put down. Like this is illegal. This is not okay. Any public speech, anyone addressing the public will be quick to say, yeah, this is illegal. This is not okay. However, most of those same people will practice it in private. When it comes down to like the day-to-day living, when it's, oh, hey, I need this, my family needs this, they'll be ready to offer a bribe. So from that same source I mentioned before, in the Philippines, 17.5% of the respondents on average, that's between 9 and 32% for each year. They did this from 2004 to 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So 17.5% on average admitted to paying a bribe to officials. Obviously, there will be others that don't admit that because it's a public setting that they're admitting it in, which is kind of what they were talking about earlier. It's like they're never going to admit to it publicly, but most will offer a bribe. So I guess what are all of your thoughts? Do you think it's cultural, it's okay, it's illegal, it's not okay? One way I almost thought about it, think of it like speed limits. Those are laws, right? But we don't always follow those exactly. Most people think it's acceptable to go 5 to 10 over, and like they don't really enforce it. In most cases, that's kind of the case here. What are all your thoughts? Do you think that's a good comparison? Do you think it's not?
I think with the issue of bribery, you have to get down to understanding what is the culture talking about when they talk about bribery? Like would they call this bribery, or like the elders would they just call it a gift for services or like a tip? I think we talked about that in this cultural anthropology, maybe. Yeah, but like would it be almost considered a tip? And then going back to the Bible, what does the Bible call a bribe? Just from the verses I've seen, it always seems to go back to perverting justice, especially when it comes to the needy and those who can't offer a bribe. So would this circumstance fall under that? Would this be something that would cause a needy person to be unable to receive justice because of the bribe that is offered? So a couple thoughts, I guess.
Right, let me put you on the spot, my friend. Which cultural value are we talking about here?
What are the two again?
Yeah, remember? Anybody who's had, you took cultural anthropology with me?
I'm doing it online.
You did it online?
Yeah.
Sorry.
They said.
I should know that. So which cultural value is in question here?
Universalist in particular.
Yeah, which we call rules, the Sun One rules.
Right.
So can you just briefly remind us of what those mean? Particularism versus universalism. What are we saying?
rules are okay, like set in stone, you have to follow them, or they're just kind of guidelines, and you have to put your family is like more important.
Okay, yes, that's part of it. There's one other element that we should probably mention, and it relates to that. When we say particularism,
Like the application of the rule depends on the person.
yes, rules don't apply consistently to everybody. Now, that may or may not contribute to this discussion. Are we really dealing here with the question of whether everybody is under the same system? Maybe not, but that is partly the, or do you think it is? I mean, would you say that this is a situation where the rules wouldn't apply the same to them as it might to other people? I don't know. Let me ask you this. Let's suppose that all the Filipinos agree that it's really more of a gift in their culture. It's not considered a bribe. It's not considered illegal. It's built in to their legal system, just like 5 miles an hour over the speed limit is kind of built in to our traffic laws. Okay? Okay, so 2 questions. Number 1, is his analogy of the speed limit a legitimate comparison? And if so, even if it is, does it legitimize what they do? If you say it, well, go ahead, you answer. Is it a legitimate comparison? 5 mile an hour buffer, and this kind of a buffer.
I think the comparison definitely could be legitimate. I think it all depends on what the Bible ultimately says about bribes. So I think it is a pretty decent comparison. One, what's the second part of the question?
Well, okay, let me just comment first. I believe that if we call it a bribe, we really have to nix it because of biblical teaching. So the real question I'm getting at is, are we justified in just assuming, hands down, this is bribery? If it is, the Bible really doesn't mince words on that. So my question is, first, is his comparison of going 5 miles over the speed limit and allowing that and people doing it all the time make it okay? You know, does that, if you believe it's okay, I mean, I know people that say if the speed limit is 55, you go 55 and a half, you've sinned before God and your country. I'm serious. So, you know, do you believe that? And if you don't, if you say it's okay because the law permits it, is even though the speed limit is stated, the law is stated, but the flexibility is there, can we apply that same flexibility to this situation?
Well, just because the culture is right, or the laws allow for flexibility, doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's necessarily right before God's eyes. So you look at our laws and like laws in states or countries that allow for abortion. Just because the law allows for that doesn't mean that it's right before God because it's breaking His law. Not just dealing with governmental laws here.
Okay. God established civil authority, right? So our police officers out here, they've been established by God ultimately, right? Romans 13. If they, in applying the law, allow 5 miles an hour for the law, they're not just applying it, they're doing it because they've been told to do it. In other words, so if we take advantage of that 5 mile an hour over, are we breaking the law in spite of the fact that they allow it, or are we submitting to the system as it's been established and functions? I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but I'm really trying to get down to the essence of what's going on here. I mean, if I ask you, how many of you drive 5 miles an hour over the speed limit? You know, in Michigan, my son told me they won't pull you over until you're going 10. Now, don't take my word for it. I think it pull over in Michigan, but he said they won't stop you in Michigan unless you're going about 10 over on the main interstates, at least. Maybe not in town. So the very law that God has established permits that flexibility. So are we disobeying God if we go over the speed limit within that context? But I get back to that first question, is this a legitimate comparison? Is this flexibility here built in to the Filipino law? Or are we assuming something that's not true here?
I'd like to say yes, but I don't know for certain because we're not inside the culture itself. But from the outside, I'm thinking yes.
Okay. Who else? Good comment.
Like all the nationals are assuming it's fine, so it seems like.
Yeah, and we all understand it's a little bit, ooh, you know, what do we do with that? Do they assume it's fine because human nature dictates that or because the legal system actually permits it?
I mean, the people in the legal system are promoting it by asking for a bribe.
Well, I would ask the same question. Are they doing it because it's legitimate to do so or because
I was gonna say,
of the human nature?
like, they're not necessarily asking for a bribe, but they're strongly hinting and suggesting, like, they're expecting one.
Did you find anywhere where it mentions something about this particular bribe or whatever about like the immigration
I
somewhere?
couldn't find a lot about that.
Because like the guy doesn't really like say how the word bribe got into it. It's just like it mentions that don't think of it as a bribe, think of it as a gift. So did the term bribe come from Pastor Luke? Like, is it like something that he came up with, like the word itself? Or is it something that kind of is like what the other person, the person in immigration said?
I don't know if the term bribe is something that was used per se.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of inherent in what's happening.
Okay.
I mean, that's kind of for you all to decide too. Is this a bribe or not?
If this had been titled "To Give or Not to Give,"
Right. Would this be an easier case study?
Because like honestly, if I had just read like the problem, the solution without all the like the last part of them like saying it's a bribe, I wouldn't have thought of this as a bribe.
Okay.
Really. But that could be just my Argentine brain thinking of things, you
Right.
know.
Mm.
I would have thought more of a you pay more to get something faster, which happens a lot in Argentina, like even like passports. If you want your passport by this, like in a couple of months, you have to pay more.
Mhm.
If not, you might get it in a couple of years, but by then your whole plans have been changed. So I thought it kind of like more on that angle. I saw more the issue on obviously pastor's conscience. He can't do that because of that. So I wouldn't say that he should take the bribe or give the bribe, I mean, or whatever, because of what he believes it is. So not as much as what is going on with giving or not giving, but how he views it. That was what I was trying to like figure out.
Right, 'cause Pastor Luke definitely views it as a bribe.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So like for me, it would be like for him, it would be wrong to do it, but for someone else, it might
So-
not because they don't think it's wrong.
So Pastor Luke views it as a bribe. The government itself views it as a bribe.
Right.
Because that's stated in their legal system. That's how it works. Well, maybe not even necessarily how it works, how it's stated that it works.
Yeah, and that's the thing I didn't know about the whole like legal.
Right.
Like it's actually something. So yeah, I'm just kind of there.
There is a practice, an economic practice that's linked to this that's very common in most countries of the world. What is that practice? When it comes to determining a price,
The more you pay, the more you get.
well,
Much you get.
that's true. I'm thinking of something else. When it comes, you're going to buy something. In many, if not most countries in the world, especially the two-thirds majority world, what takes place in the process of making that purchase?
Relationship?
Well, yeah, relationships,
Some bartering going on.
bartering, dickering, right? And you know, we Westerners like the idea of, hey, I want to know your price. We talked about this in this class or in, I can't remember, get my classes all mixed up. I have two different price lists. Was that in this class we talked about that? Okay, culture and anthropology. I have a pastor friend that used to work in a store in Fortaleza. They had two price lists, one for the tourists and one for the nationals. See a tourist coming, they know they got money, pull out the other price list. Was that wrong? Is it wrong for a store to have two different price lists depending on who's coming? If you really think it through carefully, it's not. Because they're dealing with their own national people in one way and foreigners and tourists in another way. Now, we would have a kitten here, you're doing that, you know, we'd lay a brick. But we, in some, is bribery does not fall under the category of dickering to some degree? I'm not saying yes, it does. I'm asking the question. Could it be justified as a form of bartering? Just like happens so often on the street, in the marketplace, in countries around the world.
I feel like in this case it could, because it's not like kind of like Hill was saying, like it's not a justice system. It's just you're trying to get them to like, kind of like she was saying with the passports, like you're just trying to get them to do a standard procedure faster instead of like preventing justice.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Everybody get that?
Yeah.
You're not changing the legality of the document. You're changing the speed at which it happens. Does that in some way legitimize it?
It's like buying express mail.
Kind of is.
To think of it another way, like even in our Western world, if you want a passport, you have to wait X amount of days, and that's just how it is. But if you really need that fast, you can pay a little bit extra to get expedited, and that's built into our system. So maybe even to just make it a little more thorny, we're going to put this on them. Is it not also on us?
Is that built into their system? This. In other words, is the fact that maybe it's not written as a law, you know, you can expedite a visa by paying extra, is the fact that it's not actually written in the code of law mean that it's not somehow built into the law?
Not on purpose anyway, from what I've read.
Okay.
It may be in a sense, because frankly, the customs workers aren't paid as much as they probably should be. And like they've tossed around the idea of like, do we pay them more or less to like fix this problem? Because the government definitely views this bribery as a problem.
Okay.
They are trying to correct that,
Okay.
but they are still trying to figure out how to do that. Do we pay?
You're talking about the Filipino government here.
Right.
Well, if that's really the case, do we have an option? If the government itself has stated that this is wrong, they're trying to root it out, eliminate it, do we have wiggle room here or not?
I don't think so.
I don't see how. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. That's a definitive statement by the Filipino government.
Right. Yeah, because they're trying to figure out. It's like, you know, if we pay these people more, will they stop taking bribes? It's like they're trying to get these people to stop taking bribes. They're not necessarily punishing the people who are bribing, but they're trying to stop these people from taking them.
Just anybody ever looked at the salary of NBA or NFL officials? They make good money, and there's a reason for that. The more money you make, the less likely you are to take a bribe. All this about overpaid police officers and stuff like that, in our country, there's a reason why they're well paid or should be well paid. To me, that's weighty. If that's a statement coming from the legal system,
We also have a pastor preaching in the services telling the people driving is wrong.
Right.
And so that's very hypocritical too.
So would it be hypocritical, or could he like legitimately change his views on it? So let's assume for a moment that the government didn't say this, just for continued discussion's sake, because that pretty well clarifies it in my mind. But let's say that the government hasn't said anything, like from the sense of his conscience sake, and like whether or not he's being hypocritical. Like, could he legitimately do it?
If he changed his views, I feel like he'd have to come to the church hey, I know I'm pastor. I don't know.
One other question that comes to mind: do some governments allow things like this because they believe that these are legitimate? This is legitimate flexibility, or because they simply know that a certain level of corruption exists within their country, and they know they're not going to be able to weed it out altogether, and so they allow it for that reason? To me, the motive of allowing the flexibility is a legitimate question. Why do police officers allow 5 miles an hour? Well, for one thing, cars don't have exact speedometers. Okay, police force understands that maybe their guns may not be exactly 100. In other words, there are legitimate reasons why we say, hey, we got to give you a little flexibility, because there's the factor of error built into our technology. Okay, it's another thing to say, well, we know that people are corrupt. They're going to give bribes, and they're going to, so because of the level of corruption, we've got to loosen up a little bit, or else we'll be doing nothing but having court cases all day, and we can't afford to do that. That's a different motivation for allowing flexibility in the system. You realize what we're doing here is what missionaries often do. Missionaries will sit down and talk about stuff like this. We remember in cultural anthropology, we talked about hiring a broker to get something out of port that may otherwise take a year or two. So what's the broker do? You pay the broker to get it out. The broker goes and he bribes the guy to get it out. So you're paying the broker to do your bribing for you, if you want to look at it that way. Now you could say, well, brokers are legal, and what they do with my money is up to them. I'm paying legitimate fare, and if they bribe with it, that's their business. I'm out of that. If you are a expat in another country, you have to be especially careful. What the people who live there and have grown up there do is one thing. What you do as an expat is another. And I said that's a practical reason, but it is a legitimate. They will notice that, and the legal system will often go after you in ways that they may not go after their own people, just because you're an expat. And if they think that a foreigner is trying to come in and take it and manipulate their system, they will often act more severely than they would if one of their own people is manipulating the system, just because you're a foreigner. Very, very careful about that. So, Lau, what do you think?
Really? The two alternatives are bribe or don't bribe. It's fairly straightforward. We talked about a lot of the implications of each, so.
Do you have an opinion, Lala? You haven't spoken yet. That's why I'm picking on you.
I don't know.
Tricia, you lived in Argentina. Bribery's common there just as it is in Brazil.
Yep. Yeah. At first, I was more like going towards the it's not a bribe, but I didn't really do the research on what the law actually says. So now I'm maybe going more against doing it. Yeah, for me, it was more like the reason why. Like, why are they so desperate to get someone there? Like, I get, like, they do need someone, but I don't know if to go as far as to hurry up a tramite, the papers
Mm-hmm.
to get the person there faster,
Mm-hmm.
but just like wait on how God works it out. Because it's not like he will not come. It's just it might take more time. And yeah, 5 to 10 years is a lot, especially for like ministry and stuff. But like for me, it's more like why are they so much in a hurry and not just wait a little bit, see what happens.
You just made a really good point, if I can just summarize it. Pragmatism should never drive morality. And we've talked about this in other cases too, where something just seems if this will work. Just because it works doesn't mean it's biblical. In fact, oftentimes it's not.
Hard one for me to remember.
Can we submit it to a vote?
Sure. It's a fun.
Right, you're the chairman. You can.
Oh, okay. All in favor of bribing, say aye. All in favor of not bribing, say aye.
Aye.
And I do think that in light of what you've done in your research, it is legitimate to refer to it as bribery. In fact, the Old Testament often uses the word gift as a bribe. They actually use the word for gift. But in the context, it's definitely a negative thing.
So what does he do about the elders wanting to kick her out?
I mean, I think the best he can do is talk to them and explain why.
And if he's convinced that they're going to kick him out, it may be wiser to simply say, in order to avoid a bad testimony, I'll simply resign. And I would do that if it were me. I would say, we want to preserve the testimony of Christ here. I understand I will resign, and then you can find someone else to lead from within your own group or somewhere else. Yeah.
So would this be okay if it was in another culture and if the government didn't specifically say that?
If you perceive that it was built into the system, that kind of margin of flexibility was built in and intended to be used legitimately, yeah, I wouldn't have any problems.
There are definitely some governments that way. I know we talked about that some in cultural anthropology.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely governments that expect their officers to take bribes.
But your research there confirmed the opposite.
Right.
So yeah, I
So it would be okay in like Brazil or Argentina or
No, because it's illegal. In fact, police officers in Brazil, probably in Argentina, can actually lose their job if they're caught receiving bribes. Now, they don't always wear cameras and things like our cops do here, okay, where everything's recorded.
Right.
But if they're caught taking bribes, so the officer who's bribed may have to give a little bit to his captain so he doesn't, rat on him and turn him in. So yeah, it's definitely not considered legal in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But in concept, I would say yes, if that exists, if that's built in, just like in I was just listening to a podcast this morning about Israel. I didn't realize it until listening. So they don't have a written constitution like we do. They have written documents, but much of their law is based on oral tradition and not based on written documents like we have in our country. The document countries that rely a lot on oral tradition will oftentimes, of necessity, have to apply a certain amount of flexibility. Okay, but it's not a cut and dry thing. But I think that what your research you did really sealed the deal for us. Good job. Hey, thanks. This happens on the field. These kinds of discussions, it's tough.
Mhm.
And just it was a good reminder that even before you go, you need to do some homework. How do I deal with this and that? You're not going to cover all the bases, but try to cover as many as you
As many
can.
as possible.
All right, thanks, guys. Next week from today, Lal, you are on. Shut off the recording here.
Oh, yeah, I was being recorded.